continuation of the significance of International Human Rights 75th anniversary, one of the world's most groundbreaking pledges, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is a true pleasure to welcome you on this special event focusing on a critical theme of global sustainable value chains, prospects and obstacles for South Asian SMEs. Our webinar today, held in collaboration with FNF South Asia, highlights our shared dedication to nurturing dialogue and applicable insights in the domain of business and human rights. I extend heartfelt appreciation to FNF South Asia for their steadfast partnership in this essential area. I represent Center for Responsible Business. CRB is a sustainability-focused think tank based in New Delhi. Our overarching vision is to embed sustainability at the heart of businesses. At CRB, our efforts revolve around engaging a diverse spectrum of stakeholders to craft tangible strategies promoting sustainable, responsible business practices. I'd take this opportunity to introduce Business and Human Rights Network, an initiative of the Center for Responsible Business. Business and Human Rights Network aims to simplify BHR concepts, identify opportunities, encourage BHR uptake, and thereby enable businesses to be more competitive and resilient. To start with the webinar, I would like to invite my mentor and CEO, Rijit Sengupta, for his opening remarks. Rijit serves as the CEO for Center for Responsible Business and brings in over 2 decades of rich experience in sustainable development across Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. His expertise lies at the confluence of business and community development, SME livelihoods, business regulations, responsible business practices, and the pursuit of sustainable development goals. Rijit's impactful work spans project implementation, design primarily in India and emerging economies while advocating for amplified global dialogue on sustainable business practices. Welcome, Rijit. Rijit, I would like to ask your permission before you speak to play a minute video, which would also be the context setter for this webinar.
Yeah, sounds good.
Team, can you please play the video?
Thank you. Thank you, Shubham, and thanks to all our colleagues for joining us here today at this event where we celebrate the Human Rights Day, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Really very happy to see this continued collaboration between the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung and CRB on the subject of business and human rights, and the growing interest of the practitioners community on this topic. Over the years, it has become an issue which has drawn the attention of a wider community of practitioners, both from industry and other stakeholders. So that gives us a lot of heart in terms of looking at this issue closely and seeing how we are able to use this in order to engage not just within India, but also on issues pertaining to global value chains. And that is exactly the focus of today's conversation, where we talk about global value chains and in that context, the issue of business and human rights, specifically from the interest of the MSME in South Asia. We have a very eminent and an august group of speakers who I'd like also myself to hear to But before that, let me sort of put my two paisa on the issue before we get started. It is very interesting to see how over the years the agenda in Geneva and in Paris have come closer together. When I say Geneva, it is essentially the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, and really the seat of human rights. And when I say Paris, it is essentially the climate community and the climate action and everything that happens around it. And not just in terms of the agenda or the issue. In fact, even the timing between the two events is also come closer. So a lot of people, stakeholders, and practitioners were in Geneva end of November, and from there, some of them actually also went to the COP in Dubai. And if you look at I was looking at some of the outcome documents from the UN Business and Human Rights Forum, which was held in Geneva. And one of the things which really sort of strikes us is this closeness or the fact that the gap between human rights and environment is decreasing, and there's much more alignment between the two. And looking at the two issues together, especially from a business perspective, is becoming more and more material. And in that context, subject, for example, just transition is getting equal amount of attention in the UN Forum and also in COP, and that gives us a lot of, that is very exciting, especially when you look at a country like India, and also the topic that we are going to discuss here today. The other interesting issue, which I'm sure our colleagues will discuss today, is in terms of the growing the slew of legislations at the international level. There is a fair bit of traction right now, especially in Brussels, but also in some of the other OECD countries, wherein the legislations, a number of legislations are being developed and developed pretty fast. So a number of legislations are being developed by the European Union, for example, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or even the European Union Deforestation-Free Regulation, and so on and so forth. That will also be interesting on how it plays out. There's a fair bit of right now, I would say, concern, especially in some of the countries of networks of production like this region, about what implications will it have on small and medium enterprises, on exports, on market access possibilities, and so on. So there is a need definitely for and if there was a time for the North and the South per se to come together, it is now. The goods and services which move from this part of the world to the North are as important to the North as they are for the South. So therefore, this calls for it is the right time for us to come together and start looking at issues on both sides. And I think finally, the point that I wanted to make is that I think the government of India has done a wonderful, great amount of work over the last decade or so in creating a culture on the whole responsible business agenda by mandating the disclosures among the top 1,000 companies. And of course, we have our colleague from SEBI who is going to talk about that, but also creating this whole culture about starting to look at disclosures more granularly and ensuring that some of those information is available. And in the disclosure, it is not just the own operations, but the aspiration is also look at the value chain. So if companies are able to take the disclosure seriously, provide the kind of quality and the information that is required, that will definitely help them in responding to these new expectations that these legislations, the European Union and other OECD countries bring in. So it is really the time when the expectations and the aspirations from both sides could align. And I think our colleagues and the speakers today are going to definitely talk about those things. So on that note, let me welcome you all again to this wonderful occasion, and thank you once again for joining us, the participants who've joined us, and of course our very eminent speakers. And it gives me great honor also to, as my colleague suggested, to introduce our speaker, Mr. Carl Julius Cronenberg, who's going to speak after me, and really happy, Mr. Cronenberg, for you to have agreed to give us the keynote address. If I may, with your permission, kindly introduce you very, very briefly. So, Mr. Carl Julius Cronenberg is an entrepreneur from Arnsberg, Westphalia, who has been a member of the German Bundestag since 2017. Since then, he has been a full member of the Labor and the Social Affairs Committee, and has been a deputy member of the Economic and European Union Affairs Committee since this legislative period. Last fall, the Free Democrats parliamentary group appointed him as a spokesperson for the Mittelstand, the SMEs, and free trade, and Mr. Cronenberg also chairs the Parliamentary Friendship Group for relations with the Maghreb states. And we hope gradually we also find you as a friend of the South Asia region as well, in addition to the Maghreb. So welcome, Carl Julius, and you have the floor.
Nicht on? Yeah. Thank you very much. Einen wunderschönen guten Tag und guten Morgen in die Runde. Thank you very much for inviting me and to welcome you with a short opening message. It shouldn't be a whole keynote, I hope. I'm happy to share some thoughts today, as you said, in a double role. As a member of parliament since 2017 for the Liberal Party, and spokesman for Mittelstand and free trade on the one hand, and as an entrepreneur on the other hand. Indeed, my company is very old, over 300 years old, and I'm a shareholder in 10th generation with my cousin. And we have, by the way, we have founded a very, very small distribution entity in India a couple of years ago. So I have traveled to Mumbai, and I'm looking forward to do so again. But in the moment, I'm working for the Parliament, and in my role as MP, I would like to thank, in any case, to the Friedrich Naumann Foundation to focus on India and South Asia this morning. I'm convinced that the region is of growing importance and growing relevance for all German and European trade. And this for several reasons. First, India has become, I think, early this year, definitely the biggest state in terms of population. And it's on its way to become the fourth or maybe even the third biggest economy within the next years. Second, first COVID pandemic, and then the Russian war in Ukraine and subsequent dislocations on global energy markets prove that Germany and all European economies should definitely diversify supply chains in order to increase significantly their resilience. Any dependencies have to be identified and overcome. And third reason why it's very relevant and important from a German perspective, it is crucial to strengthen rule-based international order. You may know that the German economy depends much more than any other big economy in the world from its trade with other countries. We are what we say export Weltmeister. We export nearby as much as China, which is 14 times bigger than we are. And we import a lot too. So geopolitical conflicts like the Russia-Ukrainian war or Gaza conflict or the Chinese-US conflict, hopefully it will never go militarily in Taiwan. All these conflicts show to us the importance of intensifying partnerships with more regions around the globe. At the moment, we, European Union, are negotiating association agreement with the Mercosur, which is South America. But we also have to have a close look to what is happening in Africa. Thank you for mentioning the Maghreb, but I think for all of the continent of Africa. And of course, we have to intensify our partnership with India and the whole South Asia region. What seems to be a political necessity is a huge opportunity for small and medium-sized companies. Favorable conditions in your region, like democracy and English language, have turned into specific advantages since the beginning of the 21st century, when Indian economy started to grow fast. Indian exports, for example, to Germany have more than doubled during the last 7 years. Now, let's have a look at the German consumers and German business partners. There are some challenges too with them. Our European markets and Germany in special love sustainability. The consumers love to buy sustainable products. Young professionals coming to the labor market, they want to work with companies who are sustainable. And also the financial markets, capital markets, are attracting more and more capital for sustainable investments. And it's more and more important. For me personally, I'm not always sure if they just pretend because it's like, let's say, fashionable, or if there is a deep conviction. But whoever cares of sustainability has definitely a competitive advantage in our region. I want to say, unfortunately, German regulation, like the Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz, the supply chain due diligence regulation, ignores a little bit that the original responsibility is with the state, who controls and national legislation and jurisprudence. For me personally, it's very, very important that never ever Germany or the European Union regulation should weaken those efforts to grant human rights and ILO standards, and to ban modern slavery and children's work. The state itself is responsible, and not our European companies. So we have to pay attention that CSD, which you mentioned, or deforestation, or CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is negotiated at the moment in Europe, we have to pay attention that these regulations do not become a symbol of new protectionism, and they could harm a trade relationship. Okay, but we do have this regulation in Germany, and companies have to document that they apply due diligence in order to avoid legal problems and fines if they are sued. South Asian partners should take into consideration, but don't exaggerate, without any exaggeration. Why? There are risk sectors, yes, you may know about them. Whoever is involved in the risk sector, he knows about it, and he should pay attention and have a close look. This is right. But for a huge majority of companies, it's just bureaucracy. And nobody should afford too much cost, too much time to fulfill due diligence obligations. So we are fighting, our party is fighting in Brussels for a safe harbor regulation, which means that branch initiatives which show that due diligence is respected will help to avoid bureaucracy. The negotiations are going on. Maybe it even comes to its end tomorrow in the so-called trilogue procedure, and afterwards the European Rat will have to ratify. The European Parliament, unfortunately, proves that they are very, very far away from economic realities. This is really a pity, and therefore we aim to negotiate free trade agreements, more free trade agreements, for example, with India, and this has to be at arm's length, on Augenhöhe, like we say in German. My personal plan is to travel with a colleague from the Social Democrat Party next year, early next year, in the first quarter, to India to look where we stand in the FTA negotiations, which would be so much more helpful than exaggerating due diligence, bureaucracy, and other directives like you mentioned, deforestation and corporate sustainability and so on. So I wish for your day today very fruitful discussions, and I think it's a very important work to make sure that human rights and work standards like the ILO state them improve, as well as trade grows, and this becomes together for stands together for more wealth in both our country and your country. So I wish a very, very pleasant discussion, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kronenberg, and really happy to see that those points that you mentioned, they are music to our ears. That it's the spirit of the legislation has to be center, has to be at the center, and that really is most critical. So we hope that we will be able to see you in Delhi or in Bombay whenever when you decide to travel to India, and looking forward to hosting you and learning from your experience. So thank you once again for joining us here today. Let me pass on the mic to Shubham. Shubham.
Thank you. I will listen a little bit, but then I will have to leave for next meeting. Thank you.
We appreciate that. Thank you so much.
John representing. For our next remarks, I'd like to invite Mr. Pradeep Ramakrishnan. Mr. Krishnan has been a qualified company secretary and has been serving with SEBI since 2 decades, starting in the primary market department. His responsibilities have encompassed managing issue, listing, compliance, and monitoring functions in the corporate finance department. Currently, he oversees corporate bond issue and listing at the Department of Debt and Hybrid Securities. Outside work, he finds joy in book, music, and cooking and traveling. Welcome, Pradeep.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So it's a very opportune time for us to have this program coming close on the heels of the COP28, and where I think a lot of countries are taking the thing seriously. And I'm very happy to say that India is one of the countries that has been having this roadmap for quite some time, and we have been also not just talking, but we are also walking the talk. Now, as far as SEBI is concerned, SEBI's over extends to listed entities. There are around 5,000 to 6,000 listed entities in the country, and we have been at the forefront of bringing certain reforms as far as ESG is concerned, including the whole supply chain issue, and which might be useful for this panel to know. So I thought maybe I'll take this opportunity to provide some of the reforms that we have done in the listed space. So actually, we started with the BRR in 2011. It was quite some time back. because that was a time when the government brought in something called the National Voluntary Guidelines. Now, the BRR was a very significant departure because it was the first time that non-financial information other than corporate governance was being asked to be disclosed by the regulatory entities. And if you look at that, it contained all the things of elements of E, S, and G. Because normally the biggest mistake that people make when they talk about ESG is only talk about the E portion of it. The S and G generally take a backstage. But as far as India is concerned, India started with the G. Because in 2000, when we brought in the concept of corporate governance, it came with it a lot of requirements and disclosures and whatnot. So India today is probably one of the leaders in corporate governance. We also have sort of integrated the OECD principles on corporate governance into our listing regulations, which is a very notable thing. Now, then after quite some time, I think the Paris Accord was signed. And then one of the things that when we say that if I'm going to achieve a climate goal, it always revolves around measurability, right? So for measurability, it's important that both qualitative and quantitative factors are disclosed. They're taken into account, and there's truth in the disclosure, which is why there is SEBI, after the Paris Accord around 2015 was when we signed the Paris Accord. Around 2017, 2018, the central government brought something called National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct, NGRBC. And that was the foundation for the BRSR as we see today. It is probably one of the most comprehensive reporting structures in the world. Now, and it is presently applicable to the top 1,000 companies by market capitalization. And these entities have to disclose everything on all these aspects leading to environment, society, and governance. Governance, as I said, was already disclosed. And so essentially, it's about environment and society. And society, essentially, it's about human rights, whether you care for diversity, what is it? Things about child labor and things about whether you have posh complaints and all other things. So essentially the social aspects, how are you sort of integrating differentially able to people in your company, and information about human rights and a lot of these things, diversity, in fact. Recently, you must have been seeing surveys also around papers that diversity has been taking a small step above, and we've been having significant changes as far as diversity in Indian boards are concerned, which is a good thing. Now, moving from that, from the BRSR, we brought in something called the BRSR core. And the BRSR core was something on a higher plane from BRSR, because we have said that it has to contain information about certain important parameters, and it's about the assurance thing, which makes the information a lot more credible, you see. And we also talked about the fact that information about the value chain issue also comes, is placed in the public domain through the BRSR code. Now, while we have mandated the top 1,000 entities to comply with BRSR, as far as the BRSR code, owing to the granularity of information required to be disclosed on multiple issues, we have said that it will be extended to 150 companies first, and over a period of the next 3-4 years, it will be extended to the top 1,000 companies by market capitalization. Now, the next one, the next, SEBI has looked at the ESG thing in a totally holistic framework. So we have looked at ESG disclosures for mutual funds. We have looked at green bonds. The green bond framework is something which I want to talk to you about today, because the green bond framework directly correlates to the climate finance, which people are talking about. One of the questions that has been raised in the COP28 has been about climate finance. What exactly do we mean by climate finance? Some of the answers are provided by different regulations. The green bond framework of India, the definition of green bond is something which is important, because we have adopted a principle-based approach as far as green finance is concerned. Our disclosures are from the ICMA principles. The ICMA principles specifically define what green bond security is concerned. But since India is a developing country, there are certain things which are very unique as far as India is concerned. Like, for example, when we look at solar power, we have mentioned that you can raise money through yellow bonds for that. India has a very vast coastline, and there are a lot of things that are required as far as water management is concerned, purifying water is concerned. desalination plants, for example. For that, we have brought in the concept of blue bonds. And one of the most important things as far as this whole climate argument is concerned, it's about moving from a carbon intensive business to a carbon neutral business, right? For that, we have brought in the concept of transition bonds. And transition bonds will be specifically denoted by denotation called GB-T. Now, we believe that this particular framework, which has been brought in a few months ago, is something which will also add credibility. We also said there should be independent certification. Though it's on a comply explain basis for the first 2 years, subsequently it's going to become mandatory. It's going to add a lot of credibility to the fact that there is the greenness of the bond, and maybe even add to the greenium later, right? Which is important. Now, we have not just stopped with BRSR core and green bonds. We have also brought in the concept of ESG rating framework, possibly the only legal rating framework in the world. That we have brought, and that is we are going to register ESG rating providers to become an element of credibility and transparency in the ESG rating. There's something, because if you look at ESG rating, it contains a lot of aspects, and many of them are social aspects. And many of the social aspects are actually given a go by. While rating is concerned, we have seen a lot of these things happening internationally also. So we don't want that to happen here. And probably we thought we can be a beacon, or we can be an example. And so we have brought that particular reform as far as ESG ratings are concerned. The last bit of the puzzle was your greenwashing, because the everything actually boils down to the fact that it is done in a credible manner and a truthful manner. Now, greenwashing guidelines SEBI has brought, so it's a do's and don'ts that we have brought for the first time. And essentially, it also says that in case you're caught doing something that is not green, then you please refund the money to your debenture holders. So this is something which we have brought. These are all things which we believe will add credibility to the ESG framework in the country. Now, one more thing was, as far as the ESG funds, now one of the flavor of the it's around the world, the flavor of the season is ESG funds, right? Mutual funds are launching ESG funds right, left, and center. But it's important that these funds are also credible, and they also are granular in their disclosures. So we have brought in certain disclosures as far as mutual funds and these ESG mutual funds are concerned. Various categories have been specified. The granularity of the information will, we hope, will also help the stakeholders and investors decide in actually what exactly they are investing. Because this is something that is extremely important. And because around the world, if you see, as far as ESG is concerned, there is no specific convergence as far as standards, etc. are concerned. There are various standards, principle-based, rule-based, and they are also differing from country to country. Like, for example, the US, the SEC is still grappling with climate disclosures. They've received around 15 to 20,000 comments, and they've still not brought in that particular disclosure limit. Hopefully, they should be bringing very soon. So these things actually, evolve, because they also differ from country to country, as opposed to something like governance, right? So which is why it takes time. It requires countries to adopt a horses for courses policy, which I believe SEBI has adopted as far as India is concerned. So I hope that these disclosures and this framework and this whole approach to ESG in a very holistic manner by SEBI will ensure that it contributes to India's goals as far as net zero is concerned. And also it ensures that the social aspect of of business is also taken care. And because what happens is that I believe the social aspect is taken care by way of a demonstration effect, because I'm going to look at my BRSR, look at the disclosures under the social thing that I have given last time, and I will also have to give it under this year. So I will be able to make, have a report card myself, and it will also help me to improve on what I have done as a listed entity. And hopefully it's also going to contribute to the society and human rights. Thank you so much for the time. I have to go, unfortunately, because I have a meeting coming up. I wish this conference all success, and we have a list of luminaries who are also going to speak, and I hope all the participants will be enlightened with their input. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your remarks on ESG, India's journey, and much about the credibility with the bonds and climate finance. Thank you so much. With this, we'll move to panel discussion. I'd like to introduce all of you to our speakers and esteemed panelists. I'll start with Nusrat Khan. Nusrat is a lawyer, specializes in business and human rights. She has a master's from University of Michigan. She's a business and human rights specialist at UNDP India, advocating for policy changes, capacity building, multi-stakeholder engagement. Her work involves aligning with government, private sector, and civil society for human rights integration in business. Welcome, Nusrat. Next is Anil Bharadwaj, sir. Mr. Anil Bharadwaj is Secretary General of the Federation of India Micro and Small Enterprises, SME. An MBA, he has served in private sector for a decade in international trade before joining FISME in 1996. He is well versed with industrial and trade issues as well as promotional and regulatory involvement in India, and has expertise on SMEs issues on bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade agreements. He's widely acknowledged. Please welcome Anil Bharadwaj, sir. Next, I'd like to introduce us to Mr. Shiham Marika. Mr. Shiham Marika is the Secretary General and the CEO at the National Chamber of Exporters in Sri Lanka. He's a seasoned business leader driving the success of about 500 plus export firms. With expertise in market expansion and trade negotiations, he has been known for strategic leadership and fostering a global relationship. Wesley College alumnus, Marika maintains active involvement in his alma mater community. Welcome, Marika, sir. Our moderator for today will be Nandini Sharma, my colleague and senior at Center for Responsible Business. She has over 10 years of experience on governance and industry actions in the field of sustainability and responsible business behavior. In her previous engagement at ZIZ, she was responsible for driving different projects and cultivating partnerships with multiple stakeholders. Welcome, Nandini, and handing it over to you.
Right. A very good evening to all our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us for this very interesting conversation. And thank you, Shubham. May I request all our panelists perhaps to switch on their videos so that you're all visible to our listeners, viewers. I think before we delve and dive into our conversation, our panel discussion for today, I'd like to maybe take a quick pause and, sort of thank and compliment the speakers before us. I think they've shared some fantastic insights and very interesting sort of perspectives on the topic of responsible business and human rights. I think we heard Mr. Cronenberg, talk about how, laws and regulations are meant to aid, an effective adoption and uptake of, and, meant to sort of help businesses respect business and human rights. But I think there is that balancing act that needs to be sort of taken care of, which is that it should sort of not impede or get in the way of business, but, sort of add to the competitiveness. And I think we'll hear a lot more about that in our discussion today. I think we heard, we heard Pradeep talk about, the India's very unique ESG journey, how we've gone about developing national frameworks that cater to our very specific sort of realities and the context, the localization, and how we've sort of spearheaded the agenda pretty much. So I think this has been fascinating. And what I would probably, for our discussion today, what I'd like to do is sort of base it on the theme for the UN Annual Forum on BHR, which was recently concluded in Geneva. And the theme for this year was towards effective change in implementing obligations, responsibilities, and remedy. Now, to be able to sort of move the needle on that, to be able to effectively, impactfully, efficiently sort of, implement these obligations, responsibilities, and ensure access to remedy, I think what one needs to do is to put this entire debate in the context of global value chains. It's really important to understand and unpack what do we really mean by a global value chain? What are the power dynamics therein? What role, where, how do you position an SME in a global value chain? What kind of influence can a global value chain have in the global, in a very globalized economy? So I think all of these things would be sort of important to understand before we actually come with solutions, with actually thinking on the implementation aspect. So I think with that, I would like to bring in Mr. Anil Bharadwaj and Shiham Marika. to sort of, for them to sort of tell us a lot more about and sort of deep dive into how would you unpack for a layman a global value chain? Where would you position an SME? Sort of understand the role of SME as engines of growth for an economy, and then how do you see this the SMEs responding to the new developments in the ESG sector? And I'd like to maybe invite and start with Mr. Bharadwaj.
Thank you, Nandini, and thank you, CRB, for this opportunity. MSMEs, or micro, small and medium enterprises in India, are considered as backbone of Indian economy. The reason being that their contribution is remarkable. Almost 1/3 of India's GDP is contributed by a large number of MSMEs, for 64 million and above in number. In exports also, almost the latest data says almost 49% of India's exports is contributed by MSMEs, and they being the largest employer after agriculture. So keeping all these factors in view, you can understand the importance MSMEs have, and also their contribution in exports and in employment. There are over 400 industrial clusters, and almost 60% of India's exports emanate from them. But MSMEs are quite heterogeneous, starting from small trading shops to larger medium-sized company that are supplying components, equipment to aerospace and so on. So there is a very large chain in between. When we are talking about global value chains, and especially the current debate on ESG, new developments in ESG, it is a larger among the MSMEs would see this as an opportunity. But the smaller one would rather see it as a challenge. So that is the dichotomy within the MSME segment. The positives are very clear. ESG is deepening in global value chains, and going forward will be one of the most important factors for entrants. Although the reality remains the cost, but I would say now cost competitiveness is a necessary, but not a sufficient condition to join GVCs. So there could be the largest or there could be the cheapest supplier somewhere in the world, but if one is not complying to these emerging standards, it would be difficult to for them to join GVC. So that's the defining thing that has emerged. Although on the global front, if you see, China as a country which is not considered as to, particularly in the smaller segments, not doing, or you can say one of the best performance on many ESG indicators, but they still dominate the global value chains. For example, in April, if you look at the 2022 data, they have exported more than $176 billion worth value of the stuff. And the second nearest among them is less than 40. So whether it's Germany, $38 billion, India somewhere 36, Bangladesh 34, 33, Vietnam around 30, and so on and so forth. So you could still see a very large gap between China and the nearest competitor, although it is not one of the best performers on ESG fronts. But that is changing, and that's very important thing to be underlined. Of course, the positive side I would again comment is that, I mean, as we have seen that for 1,000 top listed Indian companies would soon come under the ambit of the BRS reporting, and in certain important global value chains within India, for example, automobile, food and FMCGs, apparels, etc. There is tremendous amount of deepening because of this that has started happening. So because they have to report, they have started impacting the supply chains, particularly the MSMEs. And that is creating a very robust segment within the MSMEs, which are ESG compliant. Ministry of MSME also is very actively promoting this development. The new lean schemes, for example, are very liberal in financing MSMEs that are adopting various segments and components of ESG. So overall, I would say that I would come to the challenges later, but greater opportunities are there. And also there is a fait accompli to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well said, Mr. Bhardwaj. I think one, of course, is that, MSMEs, SMEs are the backbone of any country, particularly emerging economies. And I think what is really, the point that you made on how this is turning out to be that X factor or the delta, the ESG, and how I think Indian SMEs are gearing up and using this to their advantages is very encouraging. I would like to bring in Mr. Seham Marika, but I have a feeling that he's dropped out. So I'll probably move to Nusrat and bring her in. I think, Nusrat, you're probably the perfect person to tell us on how are you seeing this space, with these new legislations, regulations emerging. How do you see this space evolving? What kind of trends and developments are you seeing? And particularly from a South Asia perspective, if you see some something very striking, some sort of trends, developments within this region, and also from a SME perspective, you could probably talk a little bit on that front. Thank you.
Thanks, Nandini. And first of all, thank you for inviting me, to FNF and to CRB for inviting me. You can't have enough of these conversations because there's a huge audience out there that we hopefully will reach someday. And of course, the knowledge is already evolving. And I like the way that you sort of tied this in with the UN forum on business and human rights that's just concluded. Some good conversations coming out from there, especially linking the whole discourse on business and human rights with the environment, and how that those are sort of linked in a way that cannot be ignored. I think coming to the legislations, and of course, a lot has been many of these have already been discussed, but given that I'll try and sort of talk a little bit about a few legislations that have been coming up across the world. Of course, I think it's somewhere in a more solid way started with the UNGPs in 2011. I mean, even before that, there was some momentum. But I think since then, there have been a lot of countries across the world who have sort of taken the lead on sort of legislating on the subject of business and human rights, responsible business conduct, or sustainable business conduct. You can call it what you like. I think within Europe, I think one of the early starters was France. I mean, with the vigilance law, the expectation was identifying of risk across suppliers, subcontractors, and the entire value chain. And then we've of course had quite a many countries follow. We now have Norway, and of course we have Germany, which the German Supply Chain Act, which has been actually. I must say, I mean, as a practitioner on this end, observing countries across the world sort of really investing their time and attention in real uptake of their laws, I think the German supply chain law is moving along quite well. We saw it coming into force earlier this year, and there already have been a lot of ecosystem actors within the space talking about it. Of course, I mean, the seminar is one such example. I think at a block level, of course, we're all waiting for the EU Sustainability Directive to come through, which will of course have a ripple effect on how countries across Europe would then legislate basis that. But I think a lot of focus coming out of the European continent on discourse on what responsible business conduct or sustainable supply chains mean. Of course, I mean, a counter argument there is also we need a global South narrative to sort of also balance that, given that the global North is of course quite ahead in sort of shaping the narrative on responsible businesses. I think within Asia, we do have some champions on the subject. I think India, of course, Mr. Ramakrishnan has already spoken about the non-financial disclosure lead that India has, of course, taken before many countries in the world in a formal national way. The BRR was an example. The BRSR now is a much more evolved, qualitative example of how the ESG conversation is now sort of framing up in India. Also, I mean, examples that he cited about greenwashing and the green bonds, I think to really legitimize the whole process as a credible one is important, because it also signals to investors that the information being collected or companies in India are taking their environmental, social, and governance impact very seriously. And what is being thrown out in the public is actual credible information that can be relied upon. I think Japan, of course, has been a good example of an Asian player. Again, putting a lot of force behind responsible practices across its own supply chain. So there's a lot of they've released their national guidelines for responsible supply chains in 2022. A lot of time investment is being made in sort of apprising companies, especially Japanese companies, to remain competitive on this subject. South Korea actually is also another country which is proposing mandatory legislation. I think on MHERDD, which is environmental human rights due diligence. I think all of this, and of course the national action plans, the good old national action plans, remain more of a vision board on business and human rights, but of course they do have relevance, and a lot of countries across Europe, of course, were again the front runners on that, but a lot of the Asian countries are also now picking up, and in South Asia and Southeast Asia, in I think Southeast Asia, we've very recently we've had Indonesia releasing its national action plan. We've also had Malaysia releasing its national baseline assessment. Thailand, of course, has been a front runner on this. Mongolia, Pakistan in this region, and Nepal, I understand, will very soon follow suit. So I think given all this ecosystem that we're operating in, I mean, we can have as many laws as possible, but of course the success of any such emerging legislation on human rights due diligence will of course boil down to how the small and medium enterprises, especially in emerging markets like India, and most of South Asia and Southeast Asia, how we adopted and implemented. Of course, a lot of work that needs to be done with the SMEs, with the suppliers, to bring them on board for discussions like this one. There is a certain amount of worry that this will add to the burden that they already, I mean, I think SMEs already operate in a very demanding ecosystem with or without sustainability talks. And this is, of course, being viewed as another compliance burden, I think. And therein lies the role of agencies such as yours, or even the UN agencies or industry associations like WISME, like Mr. Bhardwaj just mentioned, to really articulate the business case for the SMEs, to really break down that information and simplify on what is the return on investment for them when they choose to onboard and invest in the sustainability conversation. And of course, I mean, early adopters, I mean, I think one of the arguments is, I mean, any early adopter company or SME will, of course, have a competitive advantage. And those who just go beyond compliance and really sort of meaningfully safeguard the human rights that are impacted, or the environment that is impacted, will hopefully remain much more competitive in the longer run. Of course, it's all easier said than done. And but I think what is important is to, I think at this stage, it's important to raise awareness on this discourse, on the legislations, and really articulate to SMEs what is required of them I mean, the VRSR is a good example of that in India, with the top 1,000 companies now reporting on this. Very soon, the larger companies will be reaching out to the SMEs to help them fill out that information. And I think hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years, it will become more concrete for them what it really means for them to be mindful and actually embed and use tools like HRDD effectively. I'll stop there for now.
Yes. Thanks, Nusrat. I think you've packed in quite a bit, but I think for the question in terms of really, setting the context for the legislations, the regulations, the policies that are coming, I think what one can a clear takeaway from, what you've said or what I've heard is that, it's these regulations, ESG, are here to stay. The writing is on the wall that businesses, if they need to sort of continue to have access to markets, capital, they must, sort of gear up and prepare themselves to be able to sort of meet these ESG requirements. Of course, what I really would like to sort of re-emphasize is the bit on the whole global south perspective, which we feel is rather inadequate, and I think that is why perhaps discussions like these become very important to feed back into the policy forums, the relevant policy forums, that it's important to be able to understand where the SMEs stand in the global value chains, what are the power dynamics therein, where do you bring in that equity, and sort of how do you sort of take the challenges and the opportunities that an SME in an emerging economy faces, and then kind of build that into these a lot of these laws, regulations that we are seeing. So I think that is those two points that you made sort of stand out for me. I think the way we've structured also this discussion is that we try and understand the SME perspective, then of course see how the legislation bit, how this is developing, and now I'd like to probably get into the challenges bit, which is to try and understand in a more nuanced manner what are these challenges that SMEs face, and maybe if we can get specifics specific on this. And I see Mr. Shiham has joined us, and I'd like to probably get him first and his viewpoint first on one. Of course, Mr. Shiham, if you could probably talk a little bit from an exporter's point of view. How do you see in Sri Lanka the exporters sort of I've just received a message saying that Mr. Siam may not be able to join, switch on his video, which is fine.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Mr. Seham, but we can't see you, which is rather unfortunate, but we'll make do with that. My question to you is to, sort of, if you could tell us briefly, how do you see the exporters reacting and responding to some of these legislations that are coming in? And of course, you've had the privilege to be a part of a lot of these discussions on the German Supply Chain Act. And I'd like you to maybe, draw, some insights from the German Supply Chain Act and use that also as a lens to talk about some of the challenges that the SMEs face when it comes to a lot of these, laws and regulations pertaining to the ESG requirements. So I'll hand it over to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nandini. We were having some technical issues, and your team has been calling me. Anyway, I'm happy that I can at least join you through the voice. First of all, let me thank you and your team for organizing events as such, because, with regards to ethical trading and also the German Due Diligence Act, for us here in Sri Lanka and my chamber, we have around 800 members, most of them are SMEs. One of the main concerns we have is lack of awareness. So I think more